My son sold the house for $700,000, the one I had bought for him, and evicted me from it in front of the neighbors, throwing all my belongings out the window. But I could never have imagined that this was not yet the worst that could happen. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the knock came sharp and hurried, rattling the glass in my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had just settled down with a cup of tea, the kind of quiet ritual I'd grown to love in my older years. The steam curled up in the sunlight, and I thought about how peaceful the house felt. Funny, isn't it, how life can turn on the sound of a single knock? When I opened the door, there stood my son and his wife. No warning, no phone call. Just there with tight smiles and eyes that darted about like they were keeping secrets. "My son, my only boy," said the words that made my knees weaken. "We sold the house, Mom. We're moving in with you." For a moment I didn't breathe. The house? Their house? The one I had sacrificed so much to give them? I remember clutching the doorframe, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at him, searching his face for a trace of the boy I had raised. The one who used to press wildflowers into my hand and say they were for the best mom in the world. All I saw was a man standing too tall, speaking too fast, with a kind of pride that made my stomach twist. $700,000. His wife chimed in, her voice smooth and cool like she'd rehearsed it. We thought it was time to move on. That neighborhood wasn't convenient. Convenient. That word stung. I had chosen that house with such care, poured my savings into it so they could have a place to call home. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table, going over numbers until my head ached, telling myself that this was what mothers did, invest in their children's future. And now, with a single sentence, they had turned my sacrifice into a transaction. I invited them in, though my hands trembled on the doorknob. The silence that followed us into the living room was heavier than any storm. They set their bags down, too many bags for just a visit. I noticed her rings glittering when she smoothed her skirt, and I thought of the patched dresses I'd worn in the 1960s just to make sure my son had shoes for school. I asked them when they planned to find another place, though my voice was careful, soft. My son didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that chilled me more than the winter wind outside. His wife gave me that smile, polite but sharp enough to cut. I poured us tea because it was the only thing I knew to do, though the cup rattled against the saucer when I set it before them. We sat at the table where so many birthdays had been celebrated, where my son once leaned over spelling homework while I stirred soup on the stove. Now he sat across from me like a stranger, explaining in broad strokes how the sale had gone through so quickly, how they had plans but no details yet. I nodded, but inside my thoughts churned. I remembered late nights working overtime, the coins saved in jars, the moment I signed the papers for that house with a trembling hand, telling myself I was securing his happiness. And now this, the words I wanted to speak, "How could you? How dare you?" stayed locked in my throat. Instead, I stirred my tea and listened to the clink of the spoon, trying to drown out the uneasy silence that filled the room. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew something wasn't right. There was a finality in their tone, a certainty in their arrival that spoke louder than anything else. It wasn't just a visit. It wasn't even just a temporary stay. It was as if they had already decided where I fit in this picture. And it wasn't at the center of my own home. That night, long after they had gone upstairs to settle into the guest room, I sat alone in the kitchen. The house felt different, unsettled, as though the walls themselves knew a storm was coming. I wrapped my shawl tighter around me and stared at the quiet backyard, remembering summers of laughter and winters of snowmen. All the years I had carried this family on my shoulders. I thought I knew my son. I thought love and sacrifice had written a bond between us that could never be broken. But as I sat there in the stillness, listening to the distant creak of the floorboards above, I realized with a shiver that I didn't know him at all. Not anymore. It was only a week later when the blow came. A week of strained breakfasts at my table, of his wife clattering pans in my kitchen like she'd owned it forever, of their voices drifting through the hall while I tried to busy myself with chores that no longer felt like mine. I moved quietly through the rooms like a guest in my own home, telling myself patience was a virtue, telling myself my boy just needed time. But on that seventh day, a Sunday no less, he came to me with a look that made my stomach tighten. I was sitting in the parlor, folding laundry the way I always had, smoothing the pillowcases with a firm hand. My son stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his wife just behind him, her lips pursed in that way she had. "Mom," he said, his voice flat, too practiced. "This isn't your house anymore. It's ours now. You need to move out." For a moment I didn't understand. I blinked at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the grin that used to spread across his face when he played pranks as a boy. But there was no grin, no laughter. Just that cold finality in his words. "What are you saying?" My voice came out a whisper. He shifted, impatient, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "It doesn't make sense for you to stay here. We've made decisions. It's better this way." Better for who? The question screamed inside me, but I couldn't speak it. I looked at the laundry in my lap, at the shirts I had washed for him years ago when he was small, at the socks I used to darn by the firelight. All the care, all the love stitched into every corner of his life, and here he was, telling me to leave. Then came the worst of it. His wife, with her polished nails and glittering jewelry, stepped forward. "We've already started packing for you," she said briskly, as if discussing groceries. "It'll be easier if you don't drag it out." I felt the blood drain from my face. I rose to my feet, gripping the arm of the chair for balance. Outside the window, the neighbors' children were playing jump rope, their voices floating in through the open glass. A perfect, ordinary Sunday. But inside my world cracked. I tried to speak, to reason with him, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he marched past me, grabbed the boxes they had stacked in the corner, and began filling them with my things. My books, my shawls, the framed photographs of my parents. I cried out then, begged him to stop, but he didn't listen. His wife laughed softly, almost under her breath, and that laugh pierced me deeper than any insult. They carried my belongings to the window, one by one, and tossed them out into the yard. I watched in horror as the quilt I had stitched with my own hands landed in the dirt, as my teacups shattered against the stones, as neighbors gathered quietly along the fence line, whispering. My shame burned hotter than the summer sun on my face. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "This is my home." But my son's only answer was silence. He lifted the last box, my sewing basket, the very same one I'd used to mend his shirts when money was tight, and hurled it out the window as though it were nothing. The neighbors watched. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight. Others stood frozen, their hands over their mouths. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the floorboards and never rise again. My son, my flesh and blood, had thrown me out of my own life, and there I stood powerless. By evening the yard was littered with pieces of me. My memories, my sacrifices, scattered for all to see. I sat on the porch steps, numb, my shawl pulled tightly around my shoulders. The air smelled of dust and broken china. My boy didn't come to me again that night. He and his wife shut themselves in my house, lights blazing, voices drifting out through the open windows while I sat in the shadows, small and forgotten. The humiliation was complete. I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and the ache in my heart. I thought of all the nights I'd held him when he was sick, of the years I'd gone without so he could have more, of the faith I had placed in him as the man he'd become. And now all of it was rubble at my feet. As darkness fell and the neighbors drifted away, I gathered what little I could carry. A shawl, a photograph, a single cracked teacup I couldn't leave behind. My hands shook as I tucked them into a small bag. I looked up at the house one last time, my house, and saw nothing of home in it anymore. That was the night I realized I had lost not just a son, but the very ground beneath my feet. When the night swallowed up the last light, I rose from the porch where I'd been sitting like a forgotten statue. The house behind me glowed with life, my son and his wife laughing, clinking glasses, the television humming. But not for me. Not anymore. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay on that porch any longer, under the gaze of windows that once welcomed me and now shut me out. The street was quiet, the kind of small-town hush that comes after supper when folks settle into their routines. Curtains glowed, shadows moved across familiar walls, and I walked past each house like a ghost. My shoes scuffed the sidewalk, steady but heavy. I carried nothing but the shawl and a photograph I'd saved from the wreckage, my parents smiling on their wedding day. Somehow I needed them with me. People didn't stop me. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds, but no one opened their doors. Maybe they were ashamed, maybe afraid. Or maybe, like so many in this world, they just didn't want to get involved. I can't blame them. Trouble has a way of spilling into places where it doesn't belong. My feet carried me past the church, its white steeple shining faintly in the moonlight. I thought of all the Sundays I had sat there with my son, his small hand in mine, restless legs swinging against the pew. I had whispered hymns in his ear when he was too young to read, believing the words would take root in him. Now I wondered if any of it had ever stayed. The farther I walked, the more the town opened up into silence. Past the hardware store with its faded sign, past the diner where I'd once treated him to root beer floats after baseball games, past the schoolyard where I had stood shivering in the cold waiting for him to come out with his backpack bouncing. Every step pressed on a memory, each one heavier than the last. By the time I reached the edge of the lake, the night had fully settled. The water stretched wide, dark and still, except for the silver ripples where the moonlight touched. I lowered myself onto a bench, my knees aching, and pulled the shawl close. The air was cool here, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. I sat there a long time, staring at the water, listening to the faint lap of waves against the shore. And in that quiet, the weight of it all came crashing down. The betrayal, the humiliation, the loss. My son, my own flesh, had cast me out like a stranger. Tears pricked my eyes, but I held them back. Not because I was strong, but because I was empty. I had no tears left to give. My whole body felt hollow, as if life had already drained out of me. I thought then, in that terrible stillness, that perhaps my life had ended in every way that mattered. A house without a home. A son without a mother's love. What was left for me? Just this shawl, this bench, and the endless black water stretching out before me. I remembered my husband, how he used to bring me here when we were young, back when the world felt wide open. We'd sit on this very shore with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, watching the sun sink behind the trees. He would take my hand, rough from work, and say, "As long as we've got each other, we've got enough." But he was gone now, buried on a hill overlooking the town. I had carried on without him, believing my son was enough reason to keep standing. And now even that had been taken from me. The moon drifted higher. I pulled the photograph from my pocket and held it in the dim light. My parents smiling, so full of hope for a future they would never see unravel. I wondered if my mother had ever felt like this, cast aside, forgotten by the very one she had given everything for. My hands trembled as I traced the outline of their faces. I whispered a prayer, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to anymore. Perhaps to them, perhaps to the wind, perhaps to no one at all. I sat there until the night grew cold, until my fingers stiffened around the photograph, until the ache in my chest became a dull throb. The lake was a mirror of my life now, still on the surface, but with depths too dark to see through. For the first time in my years, I wondered if I had reached the end of my usefulness. No one waiting for me. No one needing me. No place left to belong. The thought crept in soft and steady, Maybe it would be easier to stop fighting, to let the world keep turning without me. I closed my eyes, listening to the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the hush of water against stone. I tried to imagine what it would be like to simply disappear into that silence, to fade like the stars when morning came. And yet, something in me resisted. A small flicker, faint as a candle in the wind but still alive. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe faith, maybe just the memory of who I once was. But it kept me sitting there instead of sinking into the water. So I waited, shawl wrapped tight, until footsteps came crunching over the gravel behind me. The footsteps behind me were slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to startle a skittish animal. I kept my eyes on the lake, the moon shimmering on its surface, and for a moment I hoped whoever it was would just pass by. I didn't want to be seen like that, small, crumpled, sitting alone as though I'd been left behind by life itself. But then a voice came, low and familiar. "Mary." I turned, my shawl pulled tight, and there he stood, Henry Lawson, my old friend from long ago. His hair had gone more silver than brown, and he leaned a little heavier on his walking stick than he used to, but those steady eyes hadn't changed. They were kind, sharp, the sort that always saw more than you wished they did. For a moment, shame burned in me. I didn't want him to see me like this, broken and tossed aside. But his face held no judgment, only concern. "What on earth are you doing out here?" he asked gently. My throat tightened. I tried to answer, but the words tangled up inside me. He didn't press. Instead, he eased himself down onto the bench beside me, slow and careful, his knees cracking as he sat. We watched the water together in silence for a while. Finally he spoke. "I passed your house tonight. Lights blazing, music going. But no sign of you. Something told me to check the lake. You always came here when life got heavy." That was true. Decades ago, when my husband was sick and the bills piled high, Henry had found me in this very spot. Back then, he brought a thermos of coffee and just sat with me until the worst of the storm in my chest passed. Tonight, his presence felt just the same, solid, unshakable. I tried to laugh, but it came out thin and trembling. Heavy is one word for it. He turned his head, studying me with those lawyer's eyes of his. He had retired some years back, but a man doesn't lose the habit of paying attention. "Tell me," he said softly. "Don't carry it alone." I shook my head at first. What was there to say? That my son had betrayed me? That my life's work had been thrown out the window for the neighbors to see? That I was no longer welcome in the very house I had built with my own sacrifices? The words felt too bitter, too humiliating. But Henry just waited, patient as a stone. And something in his patience broke through my silence. So I told him. I told him about the knock on the door, about the declaration that they had sold their house, about how stunned I'd been to hear it. I told him of the uneasy days that followed, the cruel words, the humiliation of watching my belongings tossed out into the yard like rubbish. My voice shook, but once it started, it didn't stop. Henry didn't interrupt, not once. He didn't gasp or frown in disbelief. He just listened, nodding now and then as if every word mattered. When I faltered, when tears blurred my vision and my hands trembled in my lap, he reached over and laid his hand over mine. His palm was warm, steady, anchoring me to something solid when I felt like I might blow away. At the end of it, when my voice had worn thin and my shoulders sagged with the weight of all I had poured out, I whispered the only truth I knew. "I believe I've lost everything, Henry. Everything that mattered." The words hung there in the night air, heavier than any stone. Henry was quiet for a long moment. He looked out over the lake, the moonlight casting lines across his weathered face. Then he squeezed my hand and said, with a firmness that startled me, "No, Mary. You've not lost everything. You've been robbed, yes. Betrayed, yes. But you are not finished. Not by a long shot." I shook my head, the hopelessness rising in me again. What can I do? He's my son. The law won't protect a mother's dignity. They've already taken what was mine. But Henry leaned closer, his eyes bright. You forget who you're talking to. I was a lawyer for 40 years. I know things. And I know people. Detectives, colleagues, men who still owe me favors. Don't you go giving up yet. I blinked at him, unsure if I'd heard right. But there's nothing left to fight with. Maybe not in your hands, he said. But perhaps in your memory. Think carefully. Was there ever a condition, a clause, something written into those papers when you bought that house for him? At first my mind was fogged, weary from the hurt. But as he asked, a spark flickered. I remembered the day at the notary's office, the papers spread before me, my pen scratching across the lines. I had insisted on one thing, one protection for myself, though my son had brushed it off as unnecessary. And suddenly it came back clear as day. Yes, I whispered, my eyes widening. Yes, there was a clause. I wrote it in myself. The house could not be sold without my consent. Henry smiled then. Not a grin of triumph, but a slow, steady smile of a man who had just found a crack of light in the darkest cave. There now, he said softly. That's not nothing. That's everything. And with that we can begin. For the first time in days, something stirred inside me that felt like hope. Small, trembling, but real. Henry rose slowly, his joints stiff, and offered me his hand. Come on, Mary. Let's get you home. We've got work to do. And just like that, for the first time since the knock at my door, I felt I might not be alone in this fight. Henry walked me back from the lake that night, slow and steady, his hand warm around mine. By the time we reached his little house, the lights were low and the porch smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, the way it always had. He didn't let me argue. You'll stay here tonight, he said firmly, and tomorrow we'll start putting things together. I slept fitfully on his sofa, the quilt scratchy against my cheek, but for the first time in days I wasn't outside or on a cold bench. I was under a roof with someone who cared. That counted for more than I can say. The next morning, Henry brewed coffee so strong it could have walked out of the pot on its own. He sat across the table, papers already spread out, a yellow legal pad waiting for notes. His old habits hadn't left him, methodical, precise, sharp-eyed. I watched him chew thoughtfully on the end of his pen, the way he used to in court when he was piecing together an argument. Mary, he said, I need you to think hard. Every detail. When you bought that house for your son, what exactly did you sign? I shook my head, rubbing my temples. I only remember the basics. But I do recall one thing clear as day. I wasn't about to hand over all that money without some kind of safeguard. I told the notary I wanted it written down plain, that the house could not be sold without my written consent. I remember insisting. Henry's eyes lit with recognition, as though the lawyer in him had been waiting for that spark. That, my dear, is what we call a restrictive clause. If it was written in and notarized, then your son's sale of the house wasn't legal. That paper alone might be enough to unravel this whole mess. I stared at him, hardly daring to believe. But it's been sold. They've taken the money. He leaned back, tapping the pen against the pad. Sold illegally, perhaps. If we can prove it, the court can void the sale. You'd get your house back. The words sounded too good to be true, like something out of a dream. My hand shook against the coffee cup. Henry, I don't even know where those papers are anymore. They're probably locked in that house, my house, and God knows what they've done with them. Henry's jaw tightened. Then we'll find another way. I have contacts, detectives, men who know how to get documents when people try to hide them. We'll get what we need. For a moment I felt like the woman I used to be. Back when my husband was alive and we faced troubles together, always finding a way through. But then the doubt crept back in. Even if we prove the sale was illegal, Henry, what does that matter? The money's gone. He said they sold it for $700,000. I don't believe they've saved a penny of it. Henry sighed, scribbling notes. That will hurt them in court, not help. Judges don't take kindly to squandered fortunes, especially when they were never rightfully theirs to begin with. What matters most is that clause. That is your anchor, Mary. That is your strength. I pressed my shawl tighter around me, trying to absorb his confidence. I wanted to believe, but the wound was still raw. Henry, he's my son. I don't want to destroy him. Henry's eyes softened. You're not destroying him. He's destroying himself. You're fighting for what's yours. For your dignity. Don't confuse the two. I dropped my gaze, ashamed of the tears brimming again. I just don't know if I have the strength. He reached across the table and took my hand, firm and steady. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. You've got me. And I promise you this, Mary, we will fight this and we will win. The conviction in his voice lit something in me. Small, fragile, but real. For the first time since that knock at my door, I began to believe I wasn't entirely powerless. The next few days blurred into planning. Henry called an old friend, a retired detective named Walter who still had more grit than men half his age. They spoke in low tones on the phone, arranging to meet. I kept mostly to myself, sitting by the window with my sewing basket, patching the same old shawl over and over as though keeping my hands busy would keep my mind from unraveling. But in quiet moments, memories flooded me. I thought of the day I'd signed those house papers. My son had been so proud, telling his friends he was a homeowner. I'd sat at that table with the notary, the ink heavy on my pen, making sure the clause was written exactly as I said. Without my consent, the property cannot be sold. Clear. Simple. Binding. I hadn't thought of it in years. I had trusted him. Trusted my boy not just with bricks and boards, but with my very heart. And now it was that single stubborn act of foresight that might save me. One evening, Henry sat down beside me as the sun dipped low. Do you know why I remembered to ask about that clause? He said quietly. I looked at him, puzzled. Because 30 years ago, you came to me for advice when your husband was sick. You said then that you never wanted to leave your son without something solid. You've always been a woman who thought ahead, Mary. Even in your grief, you had the sense to protect yourself. That memory stuck with me. His words warmed me more than the shawl. Maybe I wasn't as weak as I felt. Maybe somewhere deep down I had been stronger all along. That night, lying awake on the sofa, I whispered to myself, I am not finished. Not yet. Walter showed up on a Wednesday evening. I knew him the moment he stepped onto Henry's porch, even though years had added lines and softened his shoulders. His eyes gave him away, sharp, quick, always scanning. He wore a dark jacket that smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, and when he shook my hand it was firm, not pitying. I was grateful for that. Henry tells me you've got yourself a mess, he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. I managed a small smile. That's one word for it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded like he already understood more than I'd said. Don't worry, ma'am. If there are papers to be found, I'll find them. Henry set out coffee, though Walter took his black and fast. They spread a map of the town across the table, marking my house with a red pen as though it were enemy territory. Listening to them plan felt surreal. Two men strategizing around my dining table, as though my life were a case file. What we need, Walter said, is the deed, the purchase agreement, anything with that clause written in. If she signed it, it's there. And I'll bet you my last dollar they didn't bother to destroy it, they just tucked it away. I swallowed hard. But the house, they don't let me in. Not anymore. It's theirs now, in every way that matters. Walter gave a thin smile. That's where I come in. The next night he went. I couldn't sleep, pacing Henry's living room like a restless ghost. Each creak of the floorboards made me jump. Henry sat calm in his chair, but I noticed he never strayed far from the phone. He trusted Walter, but not enough to take peace for granted. Hours passed before we heard the crunch of gravel outside. Walter came back, shoulders stooped but eyes glinting. He dropped a folder onto the table with a thud. "Found 'em," he said simply. I rushed forward, hands trembling as I opened it. There they were, my papers, the deed, the purchase contract. I traced my own handwriting in the margin, shaky but firm, where I'd insisted. "This property cannot be sold without the written consent of the undersigned, Mary Ellen Whitaker." My breath caught. I had been right. It was real. Henry let out a low whistle, tapping the paper. "There it is, clear as day. They never should have been able to sell." Walter leaned back, lighting a cigarette despite Henry's scowl. "They had it in a drawer with a pile of unpaid bills. Didn't even bother to hide it properly. Makes me think they didn't know what they were sitting on." I clutched the folder to my chest, tears stinging my eyes. For days I had felt powerless, erased. But here was proof. My words, my foresight, my strength. They hadn't taken everything. Walter blew out a stream of smoke. "That's not all. I poked around while I was there. They've been living high, real high. Jewelry boxes, designer bags with the tags still on. And I found credit card statements stuffed in an envelope. They're bleeding money faster than they made it." Henry frowned. "Debts? Plenty. And if I'm reading it right, a lot of it's from casinos. Your boy has a problem, Mary." The word struck like a knife. "Gambling. My son, my boy who once saved nickels for baseball cards, who'd cried when he lost a marble to a neighbor kid, was throwing away fortunes in smoky back rooms." I sank into the chair, the paper still pressed to my chest. The grief was sharper now, cut with anger. How far had he fallen? How had I missed the signs? Henry's voice pulled me back. "It hurts, Mary, I know. But this is also leverage. Judges don't like recklessness, especially not with stolen money. Every debt he's racked up, every dollar wasted, will only help your case." I looked between the two men, Henry with his steady hand, Walter with his hard edges, and realized they weren't just gathering evidence. They were giving me back something I thought I'd lost, the chance to stand up for myself. Walter stepped out his cigarette. "Next step is building the file. We've got the deed, the clause, and proof of financial misconduct. We'll need statements, maybe even testimony. Do you know anyone who saw your things thrown out, neighbors who could speak to it?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. Mrs. Turner across the street, and the Millers next door. They watched the whole thing. They looked away but they saw." Henry made a note. "Good. We'll need them." The room felt heavier now, but not with despair. With purpose. With fight. Later that night, when I lay back on Henry's sofa, the folder clutched beside me, I stared at the ceiling and let the thought settle. Maybe I'm not powerless. Maybe I still have a voice. Sleep came easier, not because the hurt was gone, but because hope had begun to take its place. The papers Walter had pulled from my house were like a door creaking open, showing me a part of my son's life I had never wanted to see. For days, Henry and I sat at his kitchen table, piecing through them, bank statements, credit slips, past due notices. The picture that formed was darker than anything I could have imagined. My son had a gambling problem. Not just a passing weakness, not the occasional lottery ticket or card game, but a full-blown addiction. There were transactions from casinos 2 towns over, sometimes 3 visits in a week. Thousands of dollars vanishing at a time. The house money, the $700,000, was already nearly gone. I remember staring at one statement so long the numbers blurred. 20,000 lost in a single weekend. 20,000 gone in the blink of an eye. That was more than I'd ever seen in one place in my whole life. More than my husband and I scraped together in years of work. And my boy, my only son, had thrown it away like pocket change. Henry watched me carefully, his pen tapping against the table. "This is what we call motive, Mary. The debts explain why he sold the house in the first place. He was desperate. And desperation leaves a trail. I shook my head, my chest tight. I can't believe it. I raised him better than this. We lived with so little. I taught him to be careful, to save, to be grateful. Walter, sitting in the corner with his cigarette, exhaled smoke. Doesn't matter how a boy was raised. Once that itch gets in a man's blood, it eats everything: money, family, even his soul. The words cut me, but I knew he wasn't wrong. Worse still, it wasn't only the gambling. Walter had found receipts for jewelry, necklaces and bracelets, glittering things I'd never seen before. Designer handbags, coats with price tags that made my stomach turn. All for his wife. While my quilt lay in the dirt, she was strutting around town in fur. The betrayal deepened with every page. My sacrifices had been turned into trinkets, my love into debt slips. At night, when Henry dozed in his chair and Walter was gone, I sat alone in the quiet, staring at the papers. Part of me wanted to rip them to shreds, to pretend none of it was true. But another part of me, older, wiser, hardened by life, knew I had to face it. If I turned away, they would win. One evening, Henry found me like that, my hands shaking over the stack of receipts. He sat beside me and said softly, "Mary, grief and anger are two sides of the same coin. Let yourself feel both. But don't let either blind you. Right now, the truth is your weapon." I nodded, though tears slid down my cheeks. He's my boy, Henry. My own flesh and blood. And look what he's become. Henry's hand rested over mine. Yes. But remember this, you didn't make him this way. You gave him every chance. What he's done, that's his choice, not your burden. It was a hard truth to swallow. Mothers always want to believe they could have done more. That one extra hug or word of advice might have changed everything. But deep down I knew Henry was right. My son had chosen his path. And now he was dragging me into the mud with him. By the week's end, Walter had built a file thick enough to make any judge listen. Documents, photographs, witness names. He even tracked down a casino manager willing to testify about my son's debts, should it come to that. When Walter laid the folder on the table, he looked at me with something almost like respect. This isn't just a case anymore. It's a reckoning. And you, ma'am, have more fight in you than you think. I touched the folder gingerly like it might burn me. Inside was proof of betrayal, but also proof of hope. With these pages I could stand in court and say, this is the truth. This is what they did to me. That night I walked out to the porch, the summer air cool against my face. The stars stretched wide overhead, steady and indifferent. I thought of my husband, of the long nights we'd once spent worrying about bills and children, never imagining this future. I whispered to him, as if he were sitting beside me still. They tried to take everything, but I'm still here. I won't let them erase me. And for the first time, the words didn't feel like a prayer. They felt like a promise. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of smell that clings to every corner of places where people drag their lives to be judged. My knees trembled as Henry helped me up the marble steps, his hand steady on my elbow. Walter walked ahead, carrying the thick folder that had become our shield. I'd never been inside a courtroom before, not for anything of my own. I'd seen them in movies, polished wood, stern judges, sharp lawyers. But stepping through those heavy doors was something else entirely. My heart pounded, my breath short. I was a grandmother in her 70s, walking into battle armed with nothing but truth. The room was smaller than I'd imagined, but it felt enormous all the same. The judge sat high, glasses perched on his nose. The clerk shuffled papers, the bailiff stood firm. And there across the aisle sat my son and his wife. I almost didn't recognize him. His face was drawn, his shoulders hunched. He didn't look at me, not once. His wife, though, met my eyes boldly, her chin lifted as if she were the queen of the place. The sight of her in her jeweled necklace while I clutched my old shawl made my stomach twist. Henry leaned close. "Remember, Mary, let the papers speak. The truth will do the talking." The proceedings began, words rolling too fast at times, legal terms I didn't always catch. But Henry was steady, his voice strong as he laid out the facts. He spoke of the clause in the deed, clear and binding. He presented the documents Walter had recovered, my handwriting plain for all to see. Then came the evidence of the money, the debts, the casinos, the jewelry. Walter had arranged the photographs neatly in the file, and Henry laid them before the judge one by one. Each page felt like a blow, not just to my son's case but to my heart. Yet I held my chin up, my hands folded tight in my lap. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, knees shaking but spirit firm. The judge asked me to speak, and I told my story as plainly as I could. I told him how I had bought that house for my son, how I had insisted on that clause to protect it. I told him how, without warning, I had been cast aside, my belongings thrown out for the neighbors to see. My voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. I wasn't just a broken woman anymore. I was a mother standing for her dignity. The other side tried to argue. Their lawyer claimed my memory was weak, that I didn't understand the papers I'd signed. He even suggested the clause was an afterthought, not enforceable. But Henry cut through that like a blade, pointing directly to the notarized document. My name, my condition, my right. And then came the debts. The lawyer for my son shifted uncomfortably as Henry laid bare the casino receipts, the credit card statements, the unpaid bills. The judge's frown deepened with every page. My son sat still, his face pale, his hands clenched together. I searched for a flicker of remorse, some sign of the boy I had raised. But he kept his gaze fixed on the table, as if he could hide from the truth laid bare around him. When the arguments ended, the judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a long time. The room held its breath. Finally he spoke. His voice was firm, steady, each word landing like a gavel. The evidence is clear. The clause in the deed was binding. The sale of the property is void. The house shall be restored to Mary Ellen Whitaker. Furthermore, the defendants are ordered to return the funds obtained from the sale. A hush fell. I felt the weight of his words wash over me like a tide. The house, my house, was mine again. But then came the ache. Return the funds, the judge had said. Funds already gone, squandered on dice and dresses. My son slumped in his seat, his wife's face twisted in anger. They had nothing left to give. Still justice had spoken. The wrong was named, the truth upheld. As I left the courtroom, Henry steady at my side, Walter following with the empty folder, I felt both heavy and light. Heavy with grief for the son I had lost to his own weakness. Light with the knowledge that I had not been erased. Outside the sun was shining. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, breathing in the fresh air, the sky wide and blue. For the first time in what felt like years, I straightened my back and let the light touch my face. The battle was over. And though I had scars that would never heal, I had my house. I had my dignity. And I had the strength to walk forward. The day I stepped back into my house, the air felt different. Lighter, somehow, though it still carried traces of what had been done to me. The banister was the first thing I touched, my hand resting on the smooth wood like greeting an old friend. I had polished it countless times through the years, each swipe of the cloth carrying the rhythm of my life. Now, after all the noise and the fight, it was still here, waiting for me. Henry stood in the doorway, letting me take it in. "Go on," he said gently. "It's yours again." I walked slowly through the rooms, each one familiar and strange all at once. The living room still bore the faint dents in the carpet where my furniture had once stood. The kitchen smelled faintly of the spices I had left behind, though the counters were bare. Upstairs, my bedroom windows let in soft light, falling across the quilt that had been tossed aside and later rescued. I ran my hand over its frayed edges, remembering the nights I stitched it while my son slept under the very roof he had tried to strip from me. Bittersweet doesn't even begin to cover it. I had won, yes. The judge had restored my house, my name on the deed as it had always been meant to be. But standing in those rooms, I couldn't shake the shadow of loss. My son's laughter had once filled this space. His muddy shoes had once lined the hallway. And now, though the walls were mine, the boy who once called this place home was gone in every way that mattered. Henry helped carry in the boxes of what little I had salvaged. My shawl, my sewing basket, the photograph of my parents. I placed them carefully where they belonged, as though each object anchored me more firmly to the life I had reclaimed. When the last box was set down, Henry lingered, his hat in his hands. "You sure you'll be all right here?" he asked. I gave him a tired smile. I was all right here before they came. I'll be all right now. He studied me a moment, then nodded. "You're stronger than you think, Mary." With that, he tipped his hat and left me to my house, to my silence. That evening I brewed myself a cup of tea. The kettle hissed just as it always had, the steam curling in the lamplight. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once bandaged scraped knees, balanced bills, and folded laundry warm from the line. I opened the curtains wide, letting the golden glow spill into the yard, not caring who might see me there. Let the neighbors whisper if they wanted. I had nothing to hide anymore. As the tea warmed me, I listened to the quiet, not the painful silence of exile, but the soft, familiar kind that comes when a house breathes with you. I thought of my husband, of the nights we had sat here dreaming of the future. I thought of the little boy my son once was, before greed and weakness took him away. The ache remained, how could it not? Winning the case hadn't given me my son back. It hadn't returned his love, or mended the wound of betrayal, but it had given me back myself, my dignity, my home. I rose after my tea and walked room to room, opening curtains, letting in the light of my own lamps. The house glowed warmly in the evening dark, alive once more. I paused at the doorway, looking out across the yard where my belongings had once been scattered and broken. Now the grass stood tall, the air still, as if the land itself had been waiting for me to return. Later I settled into my armchair, shawl wrapped around my shoulders, a book in my lap. The familiar creak of the chair beneath me, the soft tick of the clock on the wall. These were the sounds of belonging. I whispered aloud to no one and everyone, "I'm home." And for the first time in a long while the words rang true. Looking back now, I realized the house was never just walls and windows. It was my life stitched together. Every late-night shift, every penny saved, every sacrifice made quietly so my son could have more than I ever did. Losing it felt like losing myself. But fighting for it and winning it back taught me something I'll carry until my last breath. Family isn't always what we think it is. We want to believe love alone is enough, that the bonds of blood will hold firm against greed, against weakness. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes the very ones you gave your life to can turn their backs. That truth is a hard one, sharp as broken glass. I lost my son long before the gavel fell in that courtroom. The boy who once ran through these halls with scraped knees and a grin. He is gone, buried beneath debts and pride and choices I cannot undo. That grief will never leave me. It sits heavy like a stone I carry in my pocket. But I learned something even heavier would have been to let his betrayal erase me completely. I chose to stand. And that is the lesson, perhaps. That even when you are betrayed, even when the ones you trusted most push you aside, you can still rise. You can reclaim what is yours. Not just a house, not just papers and deeds, but your dignity. Your place in the world. I often sit by the window now, tea in hand, watching the lake where Henry found me. The water is calm, reflecting the sky, and I think of that night when I believed my life was over. How close I came to sinking into silence. And yet here I am, breathing still, my shawl warm around my shoulders, my house standing tall around me. Henry comes by often, checking in, bringing bread from the bakery. We don't talk much about the case anymore. Instead, we talk about the weather, the garden, small things that remind me life can be gentle too. Walter visits now and then, always with that gruff smile, always asking if I'm keeping out of trouble. Between the two of them, I no longer feel quite so alone. No, I don't have my son's love. That wound remains. But I have myself. I have my home. And I have the quiet strength of knowing I did not let the darkness take me. So if there's a message in all this, it's this. Don't ever believe you are powerless. Don't ever believe betrayal is the end of your story. Stand up even if your knees shake. Speak even if your voice trembles. Protect your dignity like it's the last treasure you own, because in the end it is. And when you do, you'll find you can come home again. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.